Marlon Brando redefined acting forever, but off-screen, his personal life left a trail of broken marriages, a kidnapped child, and a family tragedy so devastating it made international headlines for years. Behind the Oscar wins and the legendary performances was a man who fathered at least 11 children with 4 different women, and whose own household would eventually produce one of the darkest true stories in Hollywood history. This is the real story of Marlon Brando's marriages and affairs, a childhood that shaped everything. Marlon Brando Jr. was born on April 3, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska, to a traveling salesman father and a mother who struggled with alcoholism throughout much of his childhood. Home life was, by most accounts from those who studied his early years, unstable and emotionally difficult, marked by his mother's drinking and his father's frequent, often harsh criticism. Marlon would later describe his childhood in deeply unflattering terms, painting a picture of a household defined by neglect and disappointment rather than warmth or encouragement. His mother, Dorothy, had reportedly shown genuine artistic talent and creativity of her own in earlier years, a quality Marlon would later say he recognized and admired in her, even as her drinking made her an increasingly unreliable and unpredictable presence throughout his childhood. His father, also named Marlon, ran a company selling chemical feed products and calcium products, and was, by most accounts, a distant and demanding figure who showed little patience for his son's early struggles in school, or his general disinterest in following any kind of conventional path toward a respectable career. That instability followed him through his teenage years. He struggled academically and was eventually expelled from military school, a rebellious streak that seemed to run directly counter to the disciplined, buttoned-up expectations of his father. Rather than settling into any conventional career path, Marlon moved to New York City in his late teens, drawn toward acting almost by accident, and began studying under the influential drama teacher Stella Adler, whose particular approach to performance would go on to shape the entire course of his career. Adler's teaching, rooted in a psychologically grounded, emotionally truthful approach to character work, gave Marlon a set of tools that would eventually revolutionize how audiences understood screen acting altogether. Colleagues and students who studied alongside him during this period often described a young performer whose raw talent was immediately, almost unmistakably apparent, even before he had built any real reputation within the wider theatre world. By the late 1940s, Marlon's raw, intensely naturalistic acting style had already begun turning heads on the New York stage, culminating in his legendary 1947 performance as Stanley Kowalski in the original Broadway production of A Streetcar Named Desire. That performance would eventually translate to film in 1951, launching Marlon into a level of stardom that few actors of his generation ever achieved, and cementing him almost overnight as one of the most talked about and desired men in the entire entertainment industry. His subsequent film career only accelerated that trajectory, with celebrated performances throughout the 1950s in films such as On the Waterfront, for which he won his first Academy Award in 1955, establishing him firmly as one of the defining actors of his generation. That level of overwhelming professional success, arriving so quickly and so completely, brought with it an entirely new set of pressures and temptations, and Marlon, by nearly every account from those who knew him during this period, embraced the personal excesses that came along with sudden Hollywood stardom with just as much intensity as he had once brought to his stage and screen performances. He would go on to win a second Academy Award decades later, in 1973, for his iconic performance as Vito Corleone in The Godfather, a role that reintroduced him to an entirely new generation of moviegoers and reaffirmed his status as one of the most significant actors of the 20th century, even as his personal life continued unfolding with the same chaotic intensity that had defined it for decades by that point. That same magnetism that captivated audiences in darkened theatres would soon extend into his personal life as well, drawing a long line of women into his orbit throughout the 1950s. What started as a series of high-profile romances would eventually spiral into one of the most chaotic and complicated personal histories of any major star in Hollywood, beginning with a marriage that, from its very first days, was already showing signs of the turbulence that would come to define so much of Marlon's private life. The first marriage that started it all. In October of 1957, at the height of his early film stardom, Marlon married Anna Kashfi, an actress who had been born in Calcutta, India, and raised largely in the United Kingdom. The relationship moved quickly, and the marriage generated enormous media attention, given Marlon's already considerable fame. The following year, in 1958, the couple welcomed a son, Christian Devi Brando, who would go on to become, tragically, the central figure in one of the most devastating chapters of the entire Brando family story decades later. From nearly the very beginning, the marriage between Marlon and Anna proved volatile, marked by intense arguments and a level of mutual distrust that colleagues and friends of the couple often remarked upon even during the earliest months of their relationship. Anna herself would later write about the marriage in considerably unflattering terms, describing a partnership that had, in her own account, been troubled almost from the start, weighed down by Marlon's already well-established reputation for infidelity and his general resistance to any kind of conventional domestic stability. The marriage between Marlon and Anna proved to be extraordinarily short-lived, ending in divorce in 1959, barely 2 years after it began. What followed was not a quiet, amicable separation, but rather one of the most bitter and protracted custody battles Hollywood had witnessed up to that point, stretching across more than a decade and generating headline after headline as both parents fought relentlessly over custody of young Christian. Anna Kashfi was initially granted custody of their son, but according to court records from the period, a judge later cited her ongoing struggles with substance dependency and related behavioral issues as grounds for shifting custody. When Christian turned 13, Marlon was granted full custody, a transition that Christian himself would later describe, in interviews given as an adult, as the exact point at which his own lifelong struggles with alcohol and drug use began to take hold. Anna herself continued to publicly dispute much of the narrative surrounding the custody dispute for decades afterward, publishing her own memoir years later that offered a considerably different account of events than the one that had generally circulated in the press at the time, further underscoring just how deeply contested and painful the entire chapter remained for both parents long after the legal proceedings themselves had concluded. That custody transfer, rather than offering young Christian any real sense of relief or stability, appears instead to have coincided with the beginning of his own descent into the very same kinds of substance dependency that had plagued both of his parents in different ways throughout his childhood. Biographers who later examined Christian's life often pointed directly to this period, the years immediately surrounding the custody shift, as the moment when the patterns that would go on to define so much of his troubled adult life first began to take firm hold. The most shocking chapter of that custody dispute arrived in 1972, when Anna Kashfi, still locked in bitter conflict with Marlon over their son years after their divorce, arranged to have 13-year-old Christian kidnapped while Marlon was away in France filming Last Tango in Paris. Marlon hired a private investigator, who eventually tracked the boy down, living in a tent in Mexico, among a group of hippies who had been hiding him. That episode, involving an actual kidnapping orchestrated by one parent against the other in the middle of an already deeply hostile custody war, generated its own wave of tabloid coverage at the time, offering the public an early, unsettling glimpse into just how far the conflict between Marlon and Anna had escalated beyond ordinary post-divorce tension. For young Christian himself, caught physically and emotionally in the middle of that conflict, the experience represented yet another layer of instability piled on top of an already chaotic and disrupted childhood. The private investigator Marlon eventually hired reportedly located the boy after weeks of searching, discovering him living in genuinely rough conditions alongside a loosely organized group who had been paid to keep him hidden from authorities. A resolution that, while ultimately successful, only underscored just how dangerously far the custody battle between his parents had been allowed to escalate. That harrowing episode offered an early and disturbing preview of just how deeply dysfunctional the Brando family dynamic had already become, more than 3 decades before its most devastating tragedy would finally unfold. A second marriage, built on a hidden secret. Even before his divorce from Anna Kashfi had fully settled into the past, Marlon had already moved on to a new relationship, this time with Mexican-American actress Movita Castaneda, a performer considerably older than him who had appeared in the original 1935 version of Mutiny on the Bounty, decades before Marlon would go on to star in its 1962 remake. The two married in 1960, though for years afterward, Marlon reportedly declined to publicly acknowledge the marriage at all. Movita had built a modest but genuine acting career of her own, dating back to the early 1930s, appearing in a range of films across nearly 3 decades, including a memorable early role dancing alongside Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers in their very first film pairing together. By the time she met Marlon in the late 1950s, following his own split from Anna Kashfi, her acting career had largely wound down, and the relationship between the two of them developed relatively quickly against that backdrop. Interestingly, both Anna Kashfi and Movita Castaneda would go on to outlive Marlon by more than a decade, with Movita passing away in February of 2015 at the remarkable age of 98, followed just 6 months later by Anna Kashfi's own death in August of that same year at 80. A striking final coincidence linking two women whose lives had once been so bitterly entangled through their shared connection to the same famous man. That reluctance to acknowledge Movita as his legal wife eventually became public in the most awkward way imaginable, during a 1961 legal proceeding connected to his ongoing custody battle with Anna Kashfi, when Marlon was forced, under oath, to admit that he had, in fact, married Movita the previous year. Newspaper coverage from the period seized on the revelation, treating it as yet another example of just how tangled and secretive Marlon's personal life had become, even by the standards of an industry already well accustomed to complicated celebrity relationships. The marriage produced 2 children, a son named Miko, born in 1961, and a daughter named Rebecca, born in 1966. The latter arriving even as Marlon's relationship with Movita had already grown considerably strained, and after he had, in fact, already become involved with the woman who would become his third wife. That overlap, a child born from one marriage, even as Marlon had already moved emotionally into a new relationship entirely, would become something of a recurring pattern throughout the remainder of his complicated personal history. The marriage to Movita ultimately came to an unusual and legally complicated end in 1968, when it was formally annulled rather than dissolved through ordinary divorce proceedings, on the grounds that Movita had, at the time of her marriage to Marlon, still been legally married to a previous husband, the boxer Jack Doyle. That revelation meant that Marlon's second marriage had technically been invalid from the very beginning, an almost fittingly chaotic footnote to a relationship that had already been shrouded in secrecy and confusion from its earliest days. Despite the annulment, Movita remained a steady, ongoing presence in Marlon's life for years afterward, largely through their shared connection to their 2 children. Miko, in particular, would go on to work closely within the entertainment industry as an adult, eventually becoming well known for his association with pop star Michael Jackson, working for years as part of Jackson's personal security and inner circle, a connection that placed him, in his own right, within a completely different corner of celebrity culture than the one his father had occupied. By the time that annulment was finalized, Marlon had already moved on entirely, having met and fallen for a young Tahitian woman during the filming of a movie that would go on to shape the rest of his personal life in ways that extended far beyond any single relationship, eventually drawing him toward a part of the world he would come to call home for the remainder of his life. Falling for Tahiti and a woman named Tarita. During the filming of the 1962 remake of Mutiny on the Bounty, Marlon met Tarita Teripaya, an 18-year-old Tahitian actress cast as his love interest in the film. Tarita was reportedly wary at first of Marlon's already well-established reputation as a womanizer, but he pursued her determinedly, and the two eventually married on August 10th, 1962, or according to some accounts entered into a long-term partnership that Marlon himself often referred to as a marriage, though certain details of the union's legal status remain debated among biographers. That pursuit reportedly required considerable persistence on Marlon's part, given how openly cautious Tarita had been about becoming involved with a man whose personal life had already generated so much public scandal by that point. Colleagues on the production later described watching Marlon's interest in Tarita develop gradually over the course of filming, transforming from an ordinary working relationship between co-stars into something that would end up shaping the remainder of both of their lives. Rather than bringing Tarita to live with him in Hollywood, Marlon instead purchased an estate for her in Tahiti, and the two spent only portions of each year physically together, with Marlon making regular visits to the islands that had captivated him during filming. Reports from those who knew the couple describe Marlon as a devoted, if often physically absent, father during Simon and Cheyenne's childhood years, someone who genuinely relished the time he did spend with his children in Tahiti, including reportedly enjoying fishing trips with his son whenever his schedule allowed him to visit. The relationship produced two children, a son named Simon Tehotu, born in 1963, and a daughter named Tarita Cheyenne, born in 1970, a little girl who would grow up to become the center of the single most devastating chapter in the entire Brando family's history. Tarita would also go on to raise an additional daughter, Maimiti, born from a separate relationship of her own, whom Marlon reportedly helped raise and support as part of the extended household in Tahiti. Marlon's connection to Tahiti extended well beyond his relationship with Tarita alone. He grew genuinely enamored with the region during the production of Mutiny on the Bounty, eventually purchasing his own private atoll in French Polynesia, a place he would return to repeatedly throughout the remainder of his life as a retreat from the pressures of Hollywood fame. That connection to the islands would remain one of the most consistent and genuinely meaningful threads running through the remainder of Marlon's life, offering him a kind of privacy and escape that his career and his chaotic personal history back in the United States rarely allowed. His relationship with Tarita gradually declined by 1972, though the two never formally divorced, and Marlon continued providing for her and their children for the rest of his life. Tarita, for her part, largely stepped away from acting altogether following her brief film career, focusing instead on raising her children in Tahiti and maintaining the household Marlon had established for her there decades earlier, a role she would continue in for the remainder of both of their lives, through everything that was still to come. For a period, this quieter, more private chapter of Marlon's personal life, spent partly in the seclusion of French Polynesia rather than under the constant glare of Hollywood's spotlight, offered something resembling stability compared to the chaos of his earlier marriages. But the peace of that arrangement would not last indefinitely. and decades later, tragedy connected directly to this very branch of his sprawling family would strike in a way that shocked the entire world and permanently altered how the public understood the Brando family's private reality. 11 children, 4 different mothers. Beyond his 3 marriages, Marlon fathered additional children through relationships outside of any formal marital arrangement, ultimately acknowledging at least 11 children across 4 different women throughout his lifetime. That sprawling, complicated family structure meant that Marlon's children grew up scattered across different households, different mothers, and often different continents entirely, with varying degrees of contact and closeness to their famous father and to one another as siblings. That scattered, disconnected structure stood in sharp contrast to the more traditional, unified family units most of Marlon's Hollywood contemporaries maintained, even those who had themselves been through multiple marriages. Rather than any single, consistent household, the Brando children grew up navigating an unusually fragmented set of relationships, some raised primarily in Los Angeles, others in Tahiti, each shaped by their own particular mother's circumstances, and each carrying a different, often complicated relationship with the famous father they shared. Several of Marlon's children would later describe feeling as though they had grown up as something closer to extended acquaintances than true siblings, having spent so little consistent time together during their formative years, a dynamic that only made the events of 1990 and 1995 feel, to those who lived through them, even more isolating and difficult to fully process as a unified family. Marlon's romantic life extended well beyond his 3 formal marriages as well, with reported relationships over the decades involving actress Rita Moreno, a young woman named Jill Banner, and, later in his life, his own household employee Maria Cristina Ruiz, with whom he also had children. That pattern of romantic involvement with women in close proximity to his own household, combined with his considerable wealth and fame, created a genuinely unusual family structure, even by the standards of Hollywood's more colorful personal histories. Rita Moreno, the acclaimed actress and singer, later spoke candidly in her own memoir about the difficult and at times genuinely painful nature of her relationship with Marlon during the years they were involved, describing a connection that brought real intensity alongside real heartbreak. That kind of candid, later-in-life reflection from several of the women who had been involved with Marlon over the decades helped paint a considerably fuller picture of a man whose magnetism and charm, so evident on screen, often coexisted with genuine emotional volatility and unpredictability in his private relationships. Christian, Marlon's eldest son from his first marriage to Anna Kashfi, grew up largely without the stability that either of his parents seemed capable of providing consistently, raised by nannies during his earliest years, and eventually sent away to a boarding school in Ojai, California, following his parents' bitter and highly publicized divorce. He would later describe his own family, in a 1991 interview, using language that captured just how genuinely unusual and disconnected the entire sprawling Brando household had felt to him growing up. That sense of disconnection extended well beyond his relationship with his own parents, encompassing his broader sense of what family itself even meant within a household so thoroughly reshaped by multiple marriages, half-siblings scattered across continents, and a level of constant media scrutiny that few ordinary families ever had to contend with, let alone one already struggling with as much internal instability as the Brandos. That fractured, scattered family structure, built across multiple marriages, multiple continents, and multiple sets of half-siblings who often barely knew one another, set the stage for the kind of tragedy that, when it finally arrived in 1990, seemed to confirm every dark suspicion the public had ever harbored about the dysfunction simmering beneath the surface of Marlon Brando's celebrated career. The night everything changed. By 1990, Christian Brando, Marlon's eldest son, had already spent years struggling with alcohol and drug dependency, problems that had taken root, by his own later account. Around the same time, custody of him had shifted from his mother to his father when he was 13 years old. He had dropped out of school at 16 and pursued a limited acting career of his own, though nothing approaching the level of success or acclaim his father had achieved decades earlier. That May, Christian's half-sister Cheyenne, the daughter Marlon had with Tarita in Tahiti, was staying at their father's Mulholland Drive estate in Los Angeles, 8 months pregnant with the child of her boyfriend, a young man named Dag Drolet, the son of a prominent French-Polynesian political family. Marlon had reportedly known the Drolet family for years, though Christian himself met Dag for the very first time only hours before the events that would end in Dag's death. On the evening of May 16th, 1990, Christian and Cheyenne had dinner together at a well-known Los Angeles restaurant, during which Cheyenne told her brother that Drolet had been physically abusive toward her. Christian later recalled to a reporter that his sister had gone off on what he described as a strange and unexpected tangent during that dinner, delivering the accusations against her boyfriend in a manner that struck him as genuinely alarming at the time. Christian, who admitted afterward to having been drinking heavily that night, returned to the Mulholland Drive estate and confronted Drolet directly. According to Christian's own account, a struggle ensued over a gun he had brought with him, and the weapon discharged, striking and killing Drolet. Christian maintained that he had never intended to kill Drolet, insisting he had only meant to frighten him, and later described, in painfully vivid terms, watching the life drain out of the man he had shot. Police investigators who arrived at the scene, however, found circumstances that appeared to contradict Christian's account of a physical struggle. Drolet was found shot in the head while seated on a couch, one hand resting on a cigarette lighter and the other on a television remote control, a scene investigators felt did not support the version of events Christian had described, since a genuine struggle over a weapon would typically be expected to leave behind considerably more physical disturbance than what investigators actually documented at the estate. He was arrested 2 days later and initially charged with first-degree murder, a charge that, if it had held, could have resulted in a considerably harsher sentence than what Christian would ultimately face. The severity of that initial charge reflected just how seriously prosecutors viewed the physical evidence they had gathered at the scene. Evidence that, in their assessment, painted a picture considerably more premeditated than the drunken, spur-of-the-moment confrontation Christian himself described. What happened next would draw the entire Brando family even further into the international spotlight, as prosecutors built their case around the very testimony of the woman at the center of the entire tragic incident, testimony that would ultimately prove impossible for them to obtain. A trial that tore the family apart. Prosecutors pursuing the first-degree murder charge against Christian recognized that Cheyenne's own account of the events leading up to the shooting, particularly her claims about Drolet's alleged abuse, would be crucial to proving the killing had been premeditated, rather than the result of a sudden, drunken confrontation. Cheyenne, however, refused to testify, fleeing back to Tahiti rather than participate in the proceedings against her half-brother, a decision that would go on to fundamentally shape the entire outcome of the case against Christian. On June 26, 1990, while the legal proceedings against Christian continued, Cheyenne gave birth to her son, whom she named Tuki Brando. Rather than finding stability or comfort in new motherhood, Cheyenne's mental health deteriorated rapidly in the months that followed. She attempted to take her own life on 2 separate occasions and was repeatedly hospitalized, both for drug detoxification and for psychiatric treatment. By December of 1990, a French judge had formally declared Cheyenne mentally disabled, rendering her unable to testify in her brother's trial at all. That formal declaration effectively closed off the one avenue prosecutors had been counting on to establish premeditation in the case, and it left them facing a genuinely difficult decision about how to proceed against Christian without the testimony that had originally seemed so central to proving the more serious charge they had initially filed. Without Cheyenne's testimony available to establish premeditation, prosecutors ultimately felt they could no longer sustain the first-degree murder charge, and Christian was offered a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. During the sentencing proceedings, Marlon himself took the stand in the Santa Monica courthouse, delivering an emotional statement in which he acknowledged, in front of the entire courtroom and the assembled press, that he believed he had failed as a father. That courtroom moment, one of Hollywood's most celebrated and famously private actors standing before a judge, admitting on the record to what he considered his own failures as a parent, became one of the most widely covered and discussed images to emerge from the entire ordeal. A rare and genuinely vulnerable public admission from a man who had spent much of his career deliberately guarding his private life from exactly this kind of scrutiny. Christian ultimately served 5 years of his 10-year sentence, followed by 3 additional years of probation. In interviews given following his eventual release, he reflected on the entire ordeal with evident anguish, expressing genuine regret over how thoroughly he had believed his sister's original claims about Drolle's alleged abuse. Sentiments that would only grow more complicated once the full extent of Cheyenne's own mental health struggles became more widely understood in the years that followed. For a family already fractured across multiple marriages, multiple continents, and deeply strained relationships between parents and children, the shooting and subsequent trial represented an almost unimaginable escalation of dysfunction playing out in full public view. But the tragedy of that single night in 1990 was, devastatingly, far from over, and what happened to Cheyenne in the years that followed would bring the Brando family's story to an even darker and more permanent conclusion. A second loss. The family could not survive. In the years following Doug Drolle's death and her brother's trial, Cheyenne's mental health continued a steady and increasingly alarming decline. According to later accounts, she began experiencing paranoid episodes and, at one particularly troubling point, accused her own father, Marlon, of having sexually abused her and of somehow being involved in Drolle's death, allegations she would later retract entirely. Doctors who treated her eventually diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a serious and challenging mental illness that would go on to shape the remainder of her tragically shortened life. The retraction of those accusations against her father did little to undo the damage that both the original claims and the underlying illness driving them had already caused within an already fractured family. Marlon, according to those close to him during this period, was reportedly devastated by his daughter's accusations, even after she withdrew them, understanding all too well that whatever the truth behind her claims, they reflected the genuine severity of the psychological crisis she was living through. Cheyenne's struggles were compounded further when she lost custody of her young son, Tuki, with the child ultimately placed in the care of her mother, Tarita, rather than remaining with Cheyenne herself. For a young woman already battling severe mental illness, substance dependency, and the trauma of having witnessed the death of the father of her child within her own family's home, the loss of custody of her son appeared to represent a devastating final blow. Those closest to Cheyenne during this period described watching a young woman who had once seemed vibrant and full of promise gradually disappear beneath the weight of grief, illness, and repeated institutionalization, a decline that unfolded largely away from the intense media spotlight that had followed the initial shooting and trial. But that was, in many ways, every bit as devastating to witness for those who loved her. Cheyenne had once pursued a modest modeling career of her own during the mid to late 1980s, before her relationship with Drolle and the tragedy that followed effectively brought that chapter of her life to a premature close, leaving behind only a brief professional record of the promising young woman she had been before 1990 changed everything. On April 16th, 1995, at the age of 25, Cheyenne Brando took her own life by hanging at her mother Tarita's home in Tahiti. In a detail that struck many who followed the family's story as almost unbearably poignant, Cheyenne was ultimately laid to rest in the Drolet family crypt in Papeete, meaning that in death she was reunited with the very man whose killing at her half-brother's hands had set her own tragic decline into motion 5 years earlier. News of Cheyenne's death reached Christian, still incarcerated at the time, roughly a year before his own eventual release from prison. He would later speak publicly about the devastating irony of the entire situation, expressing genuine anguish over having believed his sister's original account of abuse strongly enough to take a man's life over it, only to watch her own mental health collapse so completely in the years that followed that he began to seriously question whether her claims had ever been entirely accurate in the first place. A family legacy defined by loss. Christian Brando was eventually released from prison in 1996 after serving 5 years of his 10-year sentence, but he never fully escaped the shadow of that single devastating night in 1990. He continued to struggle with substance dependency in the years that followed his release, and he died on January 26, 2008, at the age of 49, from complications related to pneumonia. His death came less than 4 years after his father's own passing in 2004, closing out a life that had never fully recovered from the events surrounding Dag Drolle's death and Cheyenne's suicide 5 years later. Those who knew Christian in the years following his release from prison often described a man who never seemed to fully find his footing again, weighed down by both the notoriety of the shooting itself and the accumulated grief of everything that had followed it. Whatever ambitions he may have once held toward building his own acting career, largely in his father's shadow, were effectively abandoned in the aftermath of 1990, replaced instead by a considerably quieter and more troubled remaining chapter of his life. Marlon himself, by most accounts from those close to him, was never the same after the events of 1990 and 1995. Colleagues and biographers who studied his final years often pointed to the shooting and his daughter's subsequent suicide as a turning point that accelerated an already noticeable withdrawal from public life, contributing to the weight gain, reclusiveness, and general disengagement from the film industry that increasingly characterized his final decade and a half. He continued to accept film roles intermittently throughout the 1990s, but colleagues who worked with him during this period frequently noted a man who seemed to be carrying a burden of grief that never fully lifted, even during his more professionally engaged moments. Marlon Brando died on July 1, 2004, at the age of 80 in Los Angeles. His death brought to a close a life defined by an extraordinary and genuinely transformative acting career, running in constant parallel with a personal history marked by repeated instability, beginning with his own difficult childhood and extending all the way through the devastating losses of both his son's imprisonment and his daughter's death. Tributes poured in from across the entire film industry in the days that followed, celebrating a body of work that had permanently changed the craft of screen acting, even as many of those same tributes carried an unmistakable undertone of the private turmoil that had run alongside that celebrated career for the better part of 5 decades. Looking back across the full arc of Marlon Brando's personal life, 3 marriages, at least 11 acknowledged children, a kidnapping, an annulment discovered under oath, and finally, a shooting and a suicide that together destroyed 2 young lives within the same extended family. A picture emerges that stands in sharp, sobering contrast to his towering professional legacy as one of the most influential actors in the history of American film. Behind the Academy Awards and the performances that redefined what screen acting could be was a domestic life marked by instability from its very earliest days, one that ultimately produced consequences far more devastating than any bitter custody dispute or failed marriage alone could have predicted. That contrast between the disciplined, meticulously controlled artistry Marlon brought to every role he ever played, and the chaotic, often genuinely painful reality of his own family life, remains one of the most striking and enduring aspects of his entire biography. He spent his career teaching audiences and fellow actors alike how to access genuine, unguarded emotional truth on screen, even as his own family, scattered across continents and marked by tragedy, struggled for decades to find anything resembling that same truth or stability in their own private lives together. In the end, the story of Marlon Brando's marriages and affairs stands as a reminder that even the most celebrated and transformative careers in entertainment history can coexist with a private life defined by pain, instability, and loss that no amount of professional acclaim could ever fully repair. Decades after his death, biographers and documentary filmmakers continue returning to Marlon's personal history, drawn by the same tension that shaped so much of his own work as an actor: the gap between a carefully constructed public performance and the far messier, more vulnerable truth underneath it. For a man who spent his life exploring exactly that gap on screen, it remains one of the more sobering ironies of his entire story that his own family would end up living out a version of that same tension in the most painful and public way imaginable. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.